Hello everyone, Coach Robert here with another video about the chess pieces and their personality. This time we're talking about the bishops, so let's get down to it. Here's an example with all of the chess pieces all in the same color squares as this bishop here. So the bishop, I would say, is the strongest chess piece on its own color. The bishop's this diagonal moving piece, right? So it can go to any of these squares at a time. We have options about where to put it. We can't go to all of them at the same time, but it's nice to have a lot of options. And the bishop, just in terms of number of places it can go, has a high number on that one color compared to the other pieces. So here, I would recommend that you pause and just count for each piece and try to get an idea of how well each piece is guarding the dark squares or attacking the dark squares right now. Here the bishop has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. That's a lot of squares on the dark that it's controlling and attacking that it can go to in one move. And if we compare with the knight has 0, right? It can only go to light when it stands on dark. Now, even if we switched it to the other color, the most it can control is 8 and the minimum is 2. So the bishop definitely has the knight beat in terms of control of a single color. And it's worth mentioning that bishops and knights, they both control only one color at a time. So the bishop controls way more squares than a knight most of the time. If we compare with the rook, which is often considered a stronger piece than the bishop, we'll see some examples where that's not true. This rook controls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dark squares. That's it in this example. And that's really not a lot compared to 13. So even though the rook's very powerful and it controls both colors equally, it doesn't have any bias about that. It's not as good at controlling that one color as the bishop. The queen is arguably stronger than the bishop in controlling one color because it can do the rook ones as well as the bishop ones, right? So we have both of these going on. However, I would argue that the bishop is still a stronger piece at controlling that one color in the sense that the queen often has better things to do and doesn't want to have to fight against or defend against pieces attacking on that one color because the queen is just so powerful. Often it has a more complex role than attacking on just one color. So the bishop has the advantage that on that one color, it can control the most squares. And if any piece like rook or queen or king attempts to infringe on its dark territory in this case, then they're going to have a hard time fighting that bishop. The king also controls only 4. So just in terms of raw number of squares to measure the power of the bishop, it is pretty powerful on its one color, if we just consider that one color. Now, that being said, it probably sounds like a real drag that the bishop is stuck on one color, but it turns out there are pros and cons for this. So here's a diagram with all 4 bishops. So you might notice that I made the title here and the label, "The Bishops and Their Personalities." That's because I consider the 2 bishops to be actually 2 different pieces. They look the same, they move the same, we call them the same, but because they never interact with each other, right? No matter how many times we move this bishop, it'll never go on the color of the other one. Because they never interact, they actually have unique functions on the chessboard, and in that sense, they deserve to be treated separately. Some things mostly happen on the dark squares, and so this bishop is going to matter for those. Some things mostly happen in the light squares, and this bishop is going to matter more for those. For instance, it's often the case that for white, an attack early in the game will take place entirely on the light squares. You might think of the scholars or maybe you'll think of Greek gift sacrifices. Those happen on light squares. And for black, it's the opposite. They usually want to attack on f2 early in the game. So those sorts of opportunities are unique, and they uniquely employ a bishop on one color. So that's an interesting thing about the difference, but it doesn't tell us if that's good or bad. One downside of the 2 bishops being on opposite colors is that they cannot protect each other. They can only protect themselves by running away from danger or working together with other pieces, not the other bishop. The upshot of that is that these bishops will never get in each other's way because they don't travel in the same color. There's 32 squares all for this bishop and also this bishop, so actually they end up often having a unique struggle against each other as well. Now, one thing that people say about the bishops is that they're better in the endgame. So let's look at this slightly complicated example. This is from English versus Steinitz. This is an old game, very nice game. Feel free to look it up. And here, black has the bishop pair. Whenever one side has 2 bishops and the other side has either 0 bishops or a bishop into knight. We call that having the bishop pair. That's some chess terminology for you. So black has the bishop pair in the situation. Often in the middle game where the position's open, that is where some pawns have been exchanged, right? There's no pawns on these files, so 4 pawns have left the board. In these open kinds of positions, the bishops are generally thriving. They often will be better than the knight, and as a dynamic duo, they tend to even give the rooks and the queen a run for their money. So in modern chess theory, the bishop pair features quite heavily. The bishop pair is very important. Now here we're going to talk about how the bishop's long-range capabilities gives them extra power in the endgame. I think the earliest quote about the bishops and their power compared to knights is attributed to Capablanca, who said something about when you are starting out in chess, the knights are terrible to you. They really terrorize your position. But as you get stronger and learn more, you appreciate the bishop and its powers more, and the bishop becomes a stronger piece. Paraphrasing there, but that's sort of the mood. So in this example, you can clearly see how this one knight is not doing so hot. This bishop is dominating it. We say the bishop dominates the knight when it controls all of its available squares. So at the very least, this one bishop is doing great against this knight. So let's see how Steinitz handled the position. We also should note that there are pawns on both sides of the board. So here we have a bunch of queenside pawns, and we have a bunch of kingside pawns. If the pawns were exclusively on one side of the board, for instance the queen side, then this knight might not be so badly placed. Maybe it's content to sit there and guard the dark square so the bishop can't invade anymore. But as we'll see, that is not such a good thing. Steinitz made a very accurate decision here to exchange one bishop. Even though their bishop pair is really great, he really just wants to simplify the position and play with this bishop against this knight in the endgame. So some trades are happening. But nevertheless, we remain in a situation with pawns on both sides of the board. That's really impossible for them to change. So here you might want to pause the video and say, how would you continue if you were in Steinitz's position with black? If you guess that you should swap the rooks off, you're right. He played rook e8, traded those rooks, which also deactivated white's king, put it to the edge of the board. And next, he brings in the king. Now, in this situation, their threat is to come over here and take this pawn, at which point they would have a decisive material advantage. In the endgame, having an extra pawn can be really great. And this threat is very powerful. So what white would like to do is use one of these two pieces, the only mobile pieces, to go defend that. But if they go with the king, then the king is going to slip in, potentially this way. Or at the very least, they're going to progress together with the pawn. There are lots of ways that black can invade here. So defending with the king is not effective. Therefore, English attempted to bring the knight. And here you might want to pause the video again and see how you can take advantage of this situation in a favorable endgame with bishop against knight. This is the right time to trade off the bishop for a winning king and pawn endgame. The bishop's presence on the board for several moves made it so that white could not improve their position because the bishop is attacking on both sides of the board effectively, controlling this knight. The knight was never able to find a good square because of that bishop. And the knight was not content to stay because of the fact that pawns are on both sides. And the bishop doesn't really have any trouble with that. In fact, even if black was on the defending side, they could easily bring this bishop back if they needed to. But they didn't have to because now they're just winning by force, bringing this f-pawn down. So English resigned here. So that's an example of the bishop's power in the endgame. Here's another example. And this also highlights how the bishop works together very well with pawns in some situations. So the pawn can defend the bishop most of the time, and the bishop can also defend the pawn from far away because they have similar movement properties. Bishops are just much longer. So here we have a diagram where the material, if you go by traditional material counts, like 1 for a pawn, 3 for a knight and a bishop, 5 for a rook, 9 for a queen. Here, this is material equal, right? We have 3 plus 1 plus 1, that's 5 against the rook. That's 5. However, this position is not like that. It's not just equal if you based on the material count. So here it's white to play. See if by pausing the video you can find the best continuation for white. The best option is to go down the board and get that rook. Black will probably try to activate their king, but they're too late because now these pawns are going to promote. And there's nothing they could really do about it. If they were a little bit faster, maybe they could sacrifice their rook for the one pawn and then go take the other pawn with the king, but no such luck. So in this case, the bishop actually dominates the rook by working together with pawns. And even if the bishop was, farther back and the pawn was like maybe over here, it would be hard for black to ever really capture and get rid of this bishop, because a pawn would be able to support the bishop very nicely. It would provide it with an outpost square. Okay, so here we actually see another example of the bishop fighting against the knight. Here, this knight has made a little foray on the queen side, taking some pawns. It just took a pawn on a4 and b2, so well done, knight. But it turns out when the knight is near the edge, it doesn't really do well against the bishop. The bishop has a special property of being able to trap the knights. So pause the video here and see if you can figure out what white should play. They really want to take your bishop, and therefore we should play bishop b5. We say this dominates the knight because it controls all the squares the knight can really go to, except d1, but the rook has that covered. Let's see how the game progresses from here. Black started trying to advance their pawns. This game is Smyslov versus Ernst. So white created their own passed pawn. And again we see this thing where the bishop interacts very well with the pawns. The bishop plus the pawn dominates the rook, and additionally black is unable to rescue their knight. The bishop is doing double duty, and there are no other black pieces that can really harass this bishop and drive it away from its good square. So here they try to bring the king over, but it's all kind of useless. The rook stops the king from joining the fray. Notice how the pawn and the knight don't coordinate that well. The pawn protects the knight, but it's pretty easy for the white king to come over here and harass the pawn. The knight is not protecting the pawn back. So they went ahead and did something like that, and the threat of king b3 and king takes a3 was strong, so they brought the rook to defend it. Now here you might want to pause the video and find how white can win the game. The winning move is rook e8, controlling the promotion square. One of the downsides of this bishop is that it doesn't control the dark, so often the bishop will need at least one other piece to help it to get full control of the promotion path. Or other critical squares in different kinds of positions. In this case, it's just that d8 is critical, so we need the rook to help control that spot. They played a couple feeble more moves and resigned here. Now, one more thing about bishops. In the middle game, there's the concept of good bishop and bad bishop. And this is a very misleading terminology. I actually disagree highly with the use of the words good and bad to describe the bishops like this. But for historical reasons, this is the terminology that we use. So a good bishop in chess is a bishop which stands on the opposite color from the pawns. So good bishop, it's going to be, for example, if the majority of the pawns or the central pawns are on light, then the bishop has to be on dark to be a good bishop. That's just an example. A bishop is considered bad when it's blocked in by the pawns. So especially the fixed pawns. So when I say fixed pawns, I mean pawns like this e pawn or this e pawn, because they can't go through the other pawn, or maybe this d6 pawn is a fixed pawn, because if it advances, it can be captured. So when the pawns are fixed on a certain color, the bishop is not able to go through them easily because it's fixed on that one color. So just based on that definition of good bishop and bad bishop, pause the video and see if you can identify which bishop here is good and which bishop here is bad. Okay, so I hope that you found out that with the pawns on light for white, right, these guys are all kind of on the light squares, this is the bad bishop. And for black, this bishop is good because these are all on the opposite color of that bishop. Now you might be saying, well, hold on, because a lot of people are teaching beginners that they should play the Italian opening. And in the Italian opening, you put a bishop on c4 all the time. And what the coaches will tell you is that it controls the center and it attacks f7. So those are great things. So why is this considered a bad bishop? And this is actually why I disagree so much with the terminology. Because it's not like it's a strictly bad piece. It's just how it relates to the pawns is potentially bad. If you don't like it, you could always, find a way of getting these pawns rolling so the pawns are on another color compared to the bishop. But anyway, a lot of the time, that's not the best thing to do. It's not like you can always choose a position where the bishop is considered good without hindering the other bishop that you have. This is just a schematic diagram. There could be other pieces on the board that you have to think about. So for example, if you played c3, that could actually make your other bishop bad. So the key to understanding the situation is actually the notion of piece activity. And if you want to know more about that, search piece activity on my channel. I've done at least one full interactive lesson about that topic. So there's a lot of material on my channel about piece activity. And as it regards to bishops, I would say that a bishop has good activity if it has a variety of good squares to go to, right? It has other places it can go to if it wants to, or if it's happy where it is attacking important squares, I would say it's active. So here I would say that the bishop on c4 is active. It controls the center, it attacks f7. That's good. Now this bishop on c8, while it's a traditionally considered good bishop, it might not be that active because maybe we don't really care about the squares h3 and g4 and f5 that it's controlling. Maybe that's a purely defensive function. I would like to do something more active with the bishop. So to try to make this bishop active, you might maneuver it, for instance, to c6, where at least it controls the center and maybe harasses the e-pawn. So these are all some unique things about bishops, and I hope that this enhances and edifies your understanding of bishops and stimulates your imagination for how to use them in your games. So if you like this, stay tuned. I have a lot more content coming up of this variety, and I hope to see you guys for my live chess streams. And until next time, good luck with your chess. Take care.